Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review, and in this video I'm going to review 7G by A.G. Cook. A.G. Cook is a London-based producer and also the founder of possibly one of the most important, one of the most significant and one of the most revolutionary labels to come out in the 2010s, which is PC music. PC music significance in the 2010s was quite large, especially when it comes to a more futuristic side of pop and electronic music, making this label one of the past decade's contenders for some of the most futuristic stuff to come out, basically like the future of pop and electronic music. And A.G. Cook was definitely one of those people who took a big part of this, being a producer on some albums that would definitely become some of the greatest achievements from an artist's discography. I'm talking about some of the later and most important releases from artists like Charlie XCX and Tommy Cash. In general though, talking about A.G. Cook himself, he hasn't really done that many stuff like on his own as like his completely own material, and after all of those years he's been active and making music under the PC music label. This is the first time after all of those years that we actually see a debut from him, and it's a massive one. Now, I wasn't really all that excited to listen to this debut, considering that I think that he has some great works as a producer, but for his solo stuff, with some of them that I have heard in some of like the compilations of PC music, I don't think he basically makes that many interesting results, and it's quite usual to see producers make their own albums and the result not being that great, and I was worrying that this was going to also be the case with this new A.G. Cook album. It feels like he's more of a type of guy that he knows how to make a sound for another artist rather than something on his own. And I find that this is pretty much an issue when it comes to this album, as I find that this release by itself doesn't really show the true talent that A.G. Cook has shown as a producer over the years. But there have also been other concerns with this album in particular. The main thing is the whole idea and the whole concept behind it, because we're talking about a massive album over here which goes for more than 2.5 hours of material. That's like lots of stuff, and it's a massive 49 track album separated in 7 different portions. Each one of those portions has 7 tracks, and it's separated in portions that have the names A.G. Drums, Guitar, Supershow, Piano, Nord, Spoken Word, and Extreme Vocals, which instantly gives me the idea and the impression that all of those ideas are just the main focus on those particular tracks, and I'm feeling just like watching at this that it would be quite better if all of those ideas, all of those elements would just be combined together instead of just being put in so many different portions. So I was pretty concerned with this whole result. Not only that, but looking at this as a whole concept, it actually feels kind of stupid. The fact that a concept or an idea on separating the tracks and putting them in different occasions is like a unique or a refreshing idea does not necessarily mean it's a good idea, and I wouldn't see a way for this thing to actually really work, because for me the way I look at this album is like A.G. Cook presents me a massive list of sampling tracks, which if it was intended to be like a massive sample pack, I would be fine with it, but it's actually presented like a whole album, and I didn't really know how to feel about this. But even if an idea or a concept is good or not, it's the execution that matters the most. And I don't think that this album from A.G. Cook, his debut after all of those years is all that well executed. Instead, I would say that this album becomes one of the biggest chores I've heard, and actually one of the most boring experiences I've had all year when it comes to music. Now, fortunately, this album does not feel like a sample pack. If that was indeed the case, then we would talk about an abomination. But there are still so many moments over here that I think they feel really underdeveloped. There are tracks that basically present an idea or a few, but for the most part they would feel unfinished. There are so many moments over here where I basically feel like I'm just at the introduction of the song and it just basically ends, and the main point that I was anticipating for such a long time basically never comes. And there are ideas over here that do drag themselves for far too long. Now, when it comes to the very first part, AG drums, it's where my main concerns just basically came true. I felt that for the most part, most of the tracks on this first part felt quite unnecessary, because they were basically just ideas with some stretched and experimental drill and bass segments, and it basically feels sort of like a poor attempt on just making something that sounds like Aphex Twin or Square Pusher. It does have some okay and intriguing ideas in some respects, but overall the tracks would feel extremely minimal, and every single attempt on just putting an additional melody would just come out as something completely forgettable and quite unnecessary. Now, before passing this whole thing down, I do actually feel that some of the ideas over here are honestly decent. I do find that some of the moments over here are intriguing. There are some interesting portions throughout all of this massive album, and I think it mostly starts with AG guitar, which is something that I wasn't really that much prepared to get into, because the last thing I would want from an AG Cook project is to actually have some guitar ballads. But honestly, the thing with this album later on is that most of the songs over here do actually feel like songs, do feel like fully fleshed and fully structured material that do have structure from start to finish. And I think that there are actually some okay moments, my favorite one being the track Undying, which gives me a vibe that I'm sort of listening to a 2000s nostalgic alternative electronic rock style. Also kind of reminds me a bit of Moby in some respects. Moving on, I feel like Overheim has one of the most compelling ideas out of this whole project. There is also the very fun and catchy Polyphloisboisterous, or whatever this is called. Anyways, this track is a very interesting piano idea, having also a bit to it that it's quite experimental, quite industrial, and it does add to this whole experience. And even though it's one of the shorter moments, I at least find it to be kind of well developed. Also, the north section might have some of the best and some of the most complete and fully fleshed out tracks like Oohu and also Life Speed, and then finally I find the track Show Me What to be a quite cute moment. But even if those are like the main highlights out of this album, it's basically the only moments that I actually find to be kind of decent or at least bearable, because throughout this entire project, throughout 2.5 hours of material, from like 49 tracks, I've actually haven't found a single track that I do really enjoy, that I love a lot, which if you think about it is really shocking. 49 tracks and not a single moment where I would say this is a banger or like this is actually amazing. Not even a single moment over here. Like the highlights over here are just some bearable ideas. The rest of this album is just, for the most part, really painful to listen to, and here's why. For one, I think there are like multiple pointless moments throughout this whole track listing. Let's get at the drum sections, the track drum solo. Seriously, what's the point out of this track? It's basically just a drum solo going for 46 seconds. There is basically absolutely nothing to it. This just feels like it's for like a sample pack or something. I don't see really something out of this to be engaging whatsoever. I don't really see the point of this track being in the track listing. It just feels like a desperate way on just trying to fill the album, just trying to push this idea, this concept of just having 7 parts separated in 7 tracks. Same with tracks like Waldhammer, for the most part feels like a sort of pretentious piece that just has multiple like piano notes playing this very mundane and just very obnoxious MIDI section, which other artists have made an attempt in order to make it sound cool, but like A.J. Cook does not do this thing. I don't think that as an artist he manages with some of those tracks to actually make them sound cool. Instead, I feel that he's another one of those occasions where some of the things he touches just end up being still bland. There's not really something that refreshing or that much revolutionary to his sound, and there are even occasions where his whole process and the whole sound choice actually feels amateur. Some of those tracks have some really basic and generic sounds that I don't see in any sort of way with A.J. Cook just developing those sounds in order to make them sound like something really that unique or like something that refreshing. I don't really see it. And here is another issue when it comes to this whole project is the overextended use of some effects that basically try to make certain sounds to sound experimental for the sake of being experimental, but for the most part they just end up becoming quite obnoxious. There are occasions, like I don't basically remember with which one track it was, I think it was with Soft Landing, where I think this track actually starts in a really good note. I actually really enjoyed the whole melody out of this whole thing. And then for a weird reason, A.J. Cook decides that, you know what, I want this sound to just get filled on effects like detune and LFOs. And this is something that basically happens with other moments. There is like an overextended use of effect processes like detune and even in some occasions like a faster tempo, which in my opinion it makes for some of the cheapest and the weakest effects to use on a song. This album basically tries in such a poor and desperate way to put you this idea that you're listening to such an experimental and such an out there album, which is far from the truth. Instead, this album uses some of the most basic and the most generic like excuse of effects and manipulations imaginable on like electronic and pop songs. Basically not all that much in the pop oriented songs, but you get the point. This album just tries way too hard at some points and it fails in my opinion. Like there are ideas that could have been cool, but A.J. Cook just puts all of those different effects in some of those sounds. He just uses the tune, he just uses LFO, he changes the tempo, and somehow this is like experimental, this is like different. It basically ruins some cool ideas. Yet again, there are some other tracks that have the same painful and really basic and quite forgettable ideas, and they just go on and on and on with no progression. There are so many tracks that actually go for like 4 or 5 minutes and you see like little to no development to those tracks, and there are moments where you're like, why is there not more into these tracks? Like you get into the second part, guitar, which I think compared to the first moment drums, I think there are some more interesting ideas presented to this, but there are ideas like being harsh, which is so forgettable, and also the very long and so uninteresting Superstar. Then there's Supershow, which I definitely expected more out of this, since I think that this comes closer to some of the signature sounds of A.G. Cook, but there are so many lackluster tracks, and I'm like, why is there not more to those tracks? I do think that actually some of the more interesting ideas come out of the piano and Nord sections, but I was basically at this point where I would just not care anymore, because there was just so much filler in this album where I was like, I don't really care anymore. And there were still so many forgettable, uninteresting, like underdeveloped tracks. I was like really shocked with this whole thing, like where was this trying to go? And then it finally ends with the section spoken word and the extreme vocals one, which in my opinion it makes for the most deceiving ones out of this entire project, basically because I mean, it is something that it was apparent with some of the other sections, like it wasn't just drums, it wasn't just guitar, it wasn't just piano or like synths. However, there is not really a moment in like the spoken word section that actually has spoken word. Like the only moment over here was with the weird sampling of the very short track No Yeah, which I actually find it to be one of the most forgettable, one of the most uninteresting, and one of the most unnecessary moments out of this whole project. But it's with the extreme vocals one which is definitely the most deceiving one, because I do not recall a single moment out of this whole 7 tracks where I would find the vocals to be extreme. If the sense of extreme vocals is an exaggerated use of autotune and just a little bit of distortion, then I don't know, I don't really see something extreme about that. If you count out that though, towards the last tracks, I think we do get some of the more fleshed out ideas, songs that do actually feel like full songs and not just ideas being thrown around and just leading to absolutely nothing. But then we get to another factor that I don't really like about this album, and it's the vocals. Not only the manipulated vocals from A.G. Cook, but basically from every single feature out of this album. And there are actually so many interesting names out of this whole project, which actually does show the importance and the significance of A.G. Cook as a producer over the years. You have artists like Daniel Lopatin of One Tricks Point Never fame in this thing. You have artists like Caroline Polacek. You actually have Sia and Hannah Diamond on this thing, and many, many more. But the thing is that every single vocal line over here is manipulated to the point where it doesn't feel human at all anymore. And you might say that, well, that is the point. This is like a futuristic approach, like making the vocals sound robotic, sound like the sound of the future basically, which I do get and do understand in some respects. And I would say that there are projects where A.G. Cook has been part of where this hasn't been an issue. Take example with some of the later stuff from Charlie XX. Now, I might not be the hugest fan of every single direction with the vocals of Charlie XX. I might find some of the deliveries and some of the use of autotune to be way too much for my taste, but it has never been as uninteresting, as flat and as forgettable as it has been with the entirety of this project and with every single of the feature over here. And I was basically throughout this whole thing expecting the final track, the 49th one that has Tommy Cash. And in my opinion, even this song was a big disappointment. And I don't think that it has that much to do with Tommy Cash, rather than just with the way the vocals are just put into this whole mix and how they just feel non-human and they just end up becoming really bland. And yeah, it obviously doesn't feel like a Tommy Cash song. This is quite lackluster. Like the only track that basically fits with the feature out of this whole album is the track DJ Every Night that features Hannah Diamond, where even on this case, in order to get into the Hannah Diamond vocals and in a slight of a development of the track, you have to listen to like the first half of it, which is such a long and such a drawn out introduction. I don't get why it has to be this long, and for the most part it just basically feels like a very weak track out of her previous project. I could just basically go on and on about this album. There are so many tracks that I haven't covered, but I don't think it's really worth it, and I don't want this video to be much longer than it needs to. I'm just going to say that I don't really see the appeal of this album, like at all whatsoever. Because for me, I think that if you find this album to be a masterpiece or like one of the greatest projects of this year, I don't feel that you've heard that many stuff outside of the bubblegum bass era of PC music, because in no way does this album sound compelling or refreshing. I would say that at its best it's bearable and listenable. At its worst it is obnoxious, it feels pretentious, it has completely pointless tracks, and it feels very boring. The production might be good and detailed, but that doesn't really say all that much if most of the ideas are completely lackluster and the sounds by themselves are not cool. Instead they feel amateur, like something that you just put out of a door in like your first day. I can at least admit that this album can be fun, I get it. This album does have its fun moments, but overall it is such a long album and it's so hard to sit through this whole thing, especially when it has so many fillers to it. And I don't find this to be an album that shows the true talent of A.G. Cook as a producer. Quite the opposite, which is kinda sad. I'm going to give 7G a 3 out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.